So, I just got out of the Mario movie, and it was shit. I mean, getting a British guy and a Latin American guy to play two Italian plumbers, where's the logic in that? Dennis Hopper was funny though.
Monkey!
No, of course, I'm talking about the new version made by Illumination Studios. And I actually quite enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty good. It wasn't amazing by any means, but this did feel kind of like a movie where they knew what you wanted and they gave you what you wanted. It's very much a what you see is what you get kind of movie. It's not trying to break ground or anything or trying to be like the next big video game movie. It's just an entertaining movie that happens to have a very interesting origin, and it respects that origin pretty well. I don't really think I need to go over the plot of this movie because, let's face it, even if you haven't seen the advertising for this movie, you know what the plot is going to be. The Mario brothers are two plumbers, they fall down a pipe that leads them to a fantasy world called the Mushroom Kingdom. There's a princess, there's an evil turtle, he must be defeated. There. That's all the plot you need. So how about the jokes? Truth be told, the jokes actually weren't that bad. There were one or two ones that just didn't really get me going, and really the only time that I ever did groan was the time when they did the "your princess is in a different castle" gag, which I knew they had to put that in there somewhere, but it wasn't all that funny, I'm sorry. I know they tried to be clever with it, but it just wasn't all that good. But there were actually some pretty good jokes in here. A lot of them were kind of meta jokes in relation to how Mario-like physics would work in a slightly more realistic world, or at the very least even a non-video game world, and those actually were kind of funny. The one character that did really make me laugh though was the weirdly suicidal Luma that you see in Bowser's dungeon, who just constantly goes on about how he wants to die. He was actually pretty funny. And actually I will admit Cranky Kong was pretty funny, and actually his characterization by his voice actor was pretty spot on. Which leads me to the voice acting, which is one of the elements where I do have a bit of an issue with this movie. The two voice actors that I feel weren't quite the right choices, or at the very least aren't giving the best performance they could, are Chris Pratt and Seth Rogen. Chris Pratt's portrayal as Mario is definitely one of the biggest sticking points for this movie, and yeah, he does his best with the material he's given, but you can just tell throughout the whole movie it's not meant to be Mario. It just sounds like Chris Pratt, and he's not even trying to sound like Mario, he's just doing his voice with a few little American Italianisms thrown in there every once in a while. What's weird about it is that at the very beginning of the movie he starts off doing a voice that sounds a lot like Mario's traditional voice. And it was really good, and it actually sounded like it was a voice that could have worked throughout the whole movie. It wasn't like super cartoony or exaggerated like Mario's voice normally is. It sounded like a believable voice, but it still sounded like Mario. But it turns out that he was just doing a fake voice for that bit, and then when you hear his real voice, you're like, where did Mario go? I give Chris Pratt credit, but yeah, he wasn't quite the right choice. Or at the very least, he wasn't quite given the right direction to be a good Mario. I want to say you get used to his voice, but yeah, you really don't. Which is a shame because Mario's written actually pretty well in this, so if he had a better voice, he probably would have been fantastic, but otherwise, he's okay, just, yeah, he doesn't sound like the way he's supposed to sound. Seth Rogen is sort of the same kind of deal, where when you first see him, it's admittedly not quite the voice I would have imagined for Donkey Kong, but you don't exactly know that it's Seth Rogen going in. It doesn't actually sound like his typical voice, or at least the kind of voices he normally does when he does voice acting. And that actually worked out pretty well. But then for some reason, throughout the rest of the movie, he does sound like Seth Rogen, and he sounds painfully like Seth Rogen. He doesn't even sound like he's trying to do a character. Again, it just sounds like he's doing his voice. And with him, he wasn't even like playing a character or doing a funny voice at the beginning. He just happened to sound really unlike himself at first, and then for whatever reason for the rest of the movie, he just sounds like himself. It's very strange. Donkey Kong himself is okay as a character. He's definitely the sort of stereotypical meathead who's also a bit of an egotist, sort of the character you were expecting. Nothing bad, but nothing too great either, more or less what you expected. Princess Peach is actually kind of okay. Admittedly, she's nothing like Peach in the games, but to be fair, with the way gender politics and self-identity has progressed since those games, it's kind of fair enough that she would be a bit more of an action star, or at least a bit more willing to step into the fight and get things done herself. So it's definitely a bit of a weird change in character, but it works, and her voice is actually really good as well, so I'll give her credit for that. Daniel Day's voice as Luigi is actually spot on. It sounds more or less what I imagine Luigi would sound like if you were to give him a slightly more realistic voice, and he does an excellent job with it. The only downside is that he's not in much of the movie. Near the beginning, when the Mario Brothers actually go to the Mushroom Kingdom, he then gets captured by Bowser and is kept his prisoner throughout most of the movie, and we very rarely cut back to him. In fact, we cut back to him once, and then for the rest of the movie it just focuses on Mario and Peach, which is okay, but it's called the Mario Brothers movie. It's not called the Mario movie, it's brothers. They're meant to be equal footing in terms of how much they're shown in this movie. And he's barely in it, which is a shame because I really liked the way he was done. They got the cowardness down, they got his very enthusiastic element where even though he's scared, he's willing to jump into the action. They did make him a little bit of an obsessive fanboy over Mario, which is a bit weird because I always interpreted Luigi as being the kind of person who acts like he likes Mario when he's around him, but behind the scenes he really hates the fact that he's always getting second banana compared to him. But you know, it worked enough well. Keegan-Michael Key, however, as Toad, was really good. Again, not quite the characterization I would have imagined. He did remind me a lot of Toad from the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, just with a much less annoying voice. And he does actually quite work, and to be fair, some of the funniest moments in the movie actually come from him, so bravo there. But hands down, the highlight of this movie was Jack Black as Bowser. Wow, he really nailed that performance down really well. Throughout most of the movie, you don't even know that it's Jack Black. There are a couple of times where he starts to get into his very scratchy, high-pitched voice when he's particularly enraged or when he's singing. Unfortunately, when he was singing, he really couldn't quite disguise his voice very well. But regardless, you really do believe that is Bowser in this particular version of the Mario Brothers world, and it really works. And I really give credit to Jack Black because he was both really funny and in a few cases he was very intimidating, so bravo there. The animation was also pretty impressive, and it almost didn't really look like an Illumination movie. Illumination movies tend to have good animation, but they do tend to have their characters basically designed and textured as if they are toys, presumably so that when the kids go out to buy the toys they can have a bit more of a better connection with them. But that's how it's always felt with them. They don't really have the most advanced level of textures, and to be fair, they don't really make them have more advanced textures because that's just the way their animation is. But with this one, they definitely got more advanced, they got more detailed, and definitely had more of a cartoony physics about them, whereas in their previous movies their characters didn't really move that cartoony. Even in the movies where they're meant to be, they still move more or less kind of like real people do. But this one, they definitely make it a bit more exaggerated, and I think that was warranted. And it definitely has a lot of colour, you definitely can't take that away from it. It's a very bright, colourful movie, but in a good way. It doesn't feel oversaturated, it does feel like it definitely gives you a lot to look at that doesn't feel like it's overwhelming. It is a very visually appealing movie. I know it seems like I'm really highly praising this movie, but I will admit that it's not perfect by any means. There are definitely, like I said, some jokes in there that aren't that very good. The story, even when you take into account that it is supposed to be a cliched story, it doesn't feel like they're doing anything really that clever with it. I mean, I think of movies that have these sorts of premises, and I think of movies that did it amazingly well, like the Lego Movie. Now that was an incredibly, unbelievably, well, let's just face it, corporate shill of a movie, but it made it a brilliant story, and it's actually one of the best stories we've had in a kids movie in probably the last 15 years. I will admit it would have been hard to do that with a Mario movie because Nintendo is a lot more strict and hands-on with the identity of their properties and characters, so it would have been definitely harder to do that kind of semi-mocking but also semi-celebratory writing that they did with the Lego Movie, so I understand that. So this movie definitely wasn't a Lego movie, but it also wasn't a Pixels either. It is what it is. It's an entertaining movie that comes from, admittedly, a rather silly idea, but they do their best to try and make the best that they could with it without going too risky with what they could have done. Oh, and in case you're curious, yes, Charles Martinet, aka the actual voice of Mario, is in the movie. And surprisingly, he plays two characters. The one character he plays that you'll immediately tell that it's him is a character called Giuseppe, who shows up for a cameo near the beginning and the end, who kind of looks like a knockoff version of Mario and also speaks like he normally would as Mario, so that's a pretty obvious one. The other one he plays is Mario's dad, which that actually surprised me. When I heard his voice, I could recognize it, but I couldn't quite pin down who it was, and then in the credits I saw that it was Charles Martinet doing the voice. It's like, huh. That makes sense, but I did not see that coming. I would just say that if you're going into this movie expecting it to be some sort of grand thing that changes the world, be something that is like the pinnacle of all video game movies and is definitely going to change your perception of how video game movies are, this isn't it. But if you're going in for an entertaining time and having something that feels like it's faithful to the source material, this is definitely it, because man, the amount of Nintendo references in this thing. That is also one slight issue I had, is that the references did get a little bit out of hand. Most of the time they were handled pretty well, but there were occasionally times where they put in references just for the sake of references. So it's like, oh hey look, we acknowledge Kid Icarus is a thing. Okay, and what are you going to do with it? Nothing, we're just going to establish Kid Icarus was a game that we made. Alright then. There were actually a couple of clever ones, like having Foreman Spike be a bully in the first half of the movie. That was actually pretty clever, and it was a good callback to some past elements of Mario Brothers that a lot of people probably aren't going to remember. But yeah, there were a couple of times where they just had references for the sake of references, and it did get a little bit tedious, but it didn't go too overboard with it, so I'll give it that. And yeah, I found it pretty entertaining, and to be honest, I actually liked it a lot more than the Sonic movies. The Sonic movies were okay, but it did kind of feel like it was stories that weren't intended to be Sonic that had Sonic thrown in there. This one definitely feels like a Mario movie, and you're not going to mistake it for anything else. And it does actually feel weirdly timeless. They don't go for too many modern examples of humor or modern references. This feels like something you could watch at any time and it would fit, unlike the original Mario movie, which screamed 1993 at you. Although if I'm being honest, if which one I find funnier is the question, I actually find the original more funny, but unintentionally at the very least. In terms of intentional humor, yeah, the newer one is definitely better, but I think I have more of a fun time in laughing at the original, but that's just me. But yeah, I quite liked it. But let's see what I find down the pipes next time.